All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this WIOA reauthorization webinar. My name is Kirsten Bayer, and I'm from the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. I'm joined by my colleagues Sarah Blaylock and Amy Julian today for technical support and assistance, and then any facilitation and follow-up during today's webinar. Feel free to reach out to us via the chat if you have any questions. We will be recording today's webinar and sending it out via email. And then for any questions or comments or concerns today, we ask that you post those in the chat or you can hold them till the end of the webinar and ask them live. Feel free to type in the chat throughout the session though. And I believe that's all the housekeeping items that we wanted to note. I will hand it off to Julio Rodriguez for some beginning remarks.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Julio Rodriguez, Deputy Director of the Office of Employment and Training here at the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. I just want to thank you all for joining us. I see there's quite a number of folks. We're up to 75 so far. Again, just to reiterate, this is actually a kind of open conversation is really what we're thinking this to be. Lisa Jones, who's the Deputy Director for the Office of Employment and Training, is going to do the presentation. And as she goes through it, I just want everyone to keep in mind that this is really focused on Title I of WIOA reauthorization. So we are not going to be talking about the other titles other than to maybe point to certain things that would impact both Title I and some of the other titles as part of WIOA reauthorization. But the main focus today is really on Title I and what some of the impacts could be based on the House bill that was just passed and what's happening in the Senate. But this will really be an attempt by us to sort of help everyone kind of get a sense of what we see as being proposed, give you our thoughts and our thinking around it, and then, encourage you all after this presentation to really think about and to do a deeper dive into the reauthorization materials that are currently public, and that is in particular the bills that passed out of the House recently. As you look at the information that we are going over, please be sure that if there are questions to put them in the chat. And again, just to reiterate, we'll take the questions in the chat at the end of the presentation and then open it up for more questions. Thank you all again for joining us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Jones.
Great. Thank you, Julio, and thank you, Kirsten. Kirsten, if you want to go ahead and go to the first slide. I really appreciate everyone joining today. And it was great to see folks last week at the summit. It was nice catching up. So as Julio mentioned, we are going to be just talking about Title I today of the House Reauthorization Bill, Stronger Workforce for America Act. Just want to do a little bit of background about the bill before we jump into what some of the key changes are, and then how Illinois is thinking about some of those changes. So if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, Kirsten, thank you. Want to get started with the legislative timeline. Next slide. Kirsten, are we having trouble with the slides? Because I'm on the slide for the timeline. Next slide. There we go. So as you can see, the bill really progressed relatively quickly from the time that it was proposed in the House, which was December 7th of 2023, and it passed out of committee on December 12th, and then out of the House on April 9th, and it's already to the Senate Health Committee. And from what we've learned is that the Senate Health Staff Committee has been actively discussing the bill, looking at their priorities for WIOA reauthorization. And we have been fortunate enough to participate in some of the conversations with the Senate Health staff through NASWA. We're one of about 8 other states that has been participating in those conversations. They are planning, hopefully, by August, before the recess, before Congress's recess, to have something presented and a bill introduced. So next slide, if you could. I want to just kind of talk about what some of the key changes are from the House in the House bill, and we're really looking at some areas around employer-led initiatives and upgrading skilled workers. Um, Real-time labor market information was a big thing that the House was looking at, and really thinking more strategically about how you use labor market information. And so while they're talking about in the bill having continued assessment, and I hope I'll get into that just a little bit more when we dive a little deeper, the continued assessment, there is some relief by not requiring the 2-year modification for the Unified State Plan. The training expenditure rate is a big one. And while here in Illinois, we have had that training expenditure rate, I think the important thing for us as the state and as other states are looking at this expenditure rate is what's going to be included in that calculation. So, and we'll again get into that a little bit deeper. A really good thing that's happened is they've raised the cap, proposing raising the cap on some of the work-based learning programs. And then there's also a requirement, or not a requirement, sorry, there's also the opportunity for states to create a critical industry skills fund using some of our governor's set aside and local funds. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that is one thing that while we're excited about that possibility, we do feel that that's a fund that if we would do it, we would need additional funding for, rather than taking away from our local funds or our governor reserve. So Kristen, if you want to go to the next slide, please. The other area that is a big area in the House bill is just around accountability and program quality. Again, I'll get into that a little bit deeper, but they did do some restructuring of performance indicators, also looking at program quality related to how services are delivered. So allowing for virtual services and the requirement for a comprehensive facility, one comprehensive facility in each local area would no longer be in the bill. And then streamlining our ETPL list was another big area that is being focused on in the House bill, and will also probably be focused on in the Senate bill as well. If you want to go to the next slide. And then finally, just looking at pathways and innovation, there's a stronger emphasis on work-based learning for youth. They also are really interested in how we're going to serve special populations and have included some additional flexibility in the current House bill, and specifically called out codifying a program for returning citizens. There is an opportunity for states to apply to be a demonstration state that would allow for, and I'm using this term loosely, kind of like a block grant fund for the formula programs. That, while on the surface sounds like a great idea, probably usually what happens with block grant funds, as we know, is that your funding actually gets reduced rather than providing opportunities to better leverage. And then also there is an opportunity to do more technical assistance to employers with our fundings. So if you want to go to the next slide, just looking at what some of the Senate priorities are at the Senate Health Committee right now, and some of the conversations that we've been having. As you'll see on the majority side, there is a big focus for them on preparing youth and job quality. They are also very much interested in looking at support services, which we are very happy about, because that is one thing in the House bill that we would like to see improved upon, is around job quality and the ability to have more flexibility around supportive services. Lifelong learning, also another priority, and then shared worker employment access through transparent data. Then on the minority side, they would like a more balanced package that would include the Apprenticeship Act, Workforce Pell, and CTE. Was glad to see that they're also looking at a more of a holistic approach to funding so that we can leverage our other partner programs better. Data systems and transparency, I think, is on everybody's mind. And then looking at a balanced approach to mandatory funding. So if you want to go into the next slide, we'll go ahead and get into the actual provisions. Some of these I'm just going to quickly go through because right now we haven't really had a lot of time to digest because there's a lot of nuances within the legislation. So some of these we haven't really thought too much in great detail about. We're very happy to see, though, on the definitions that they are including a definition specifically for co-enrollment for digital literacy. They are changing any language in the bill around looking at proven practices to evidence-based practices. And then they also have created a definition for work-based learning. So happy to see those. And then the final one also is they've changed a couple of name definitions, changing ex-offender to justice involved, and then changing out-of-school youth to opportunity youth. And then on the board side, on the state workforce development side for the membership and functions, there were no significant changes other than the definition change that you see in front of you. On the state plan, they did require they modified some of the required elements to include, as we discussed, the economic analysis and labor market information being assessed more frequently, updating the language so that there's no longer a requirement for a 2-year modification, then adding some flexibility on state strategies, and also looking at how we can expand our strategies around economic mobility, particularly with an emphasis on skills-based hiring initiatives. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. On the system alignment for the local provisions, here's another area that will impact you all. Looking at the local workforce development areas, there is a requirement in the current House bill that all local areas, they remove the grandfathering provision is what they've done. And so the governor has 3 years to look at the current structure of the local areas in the state and come up with a redesignation process. And then as part of that redesignation process, there will be a vote that is specifically laid out in the legislation where local board chairs would have 60 days to consider the changes and vote. If the majority of the boards would disapprove of the governor's proposed recommendations for redesignation, then the board chairs would have to look at either aligning local areas with regional economic development areas or state planning regions. And then also there is a requirement, or not a requirement, but there's also within the language, the ability for local areas to come together to form regional consortiums if they would so choose. And that also includes the ability for the state to incentivize local areas if they would choose to go that route on their own. On the local workforce development board, that's really just clarifications just around what the role and the functions of the boards are. The one big thing, or one of the things, is really emphasizing the alignment with CTE programs, and then also thinking about how we convene stakeholders more strategically when we're developing our local plans, and then also clarifying that the local board's authority over the budget and administration of programs is also another change in the legislation. So next slide, please. Performance accountability there, I think from our perspective, we weren't too surprised about the performance indicators. We generally support what they're saying around modernizing the outcomes. I think they're trying to do a better job of aligning the indicators, the SAM aside, doing a better job of aligning the indicators with what the reality of the work is. So we do, though, definitely want to continue to voice our concerns and push for flexibility around the performance measures so that during times of crisis, we can get relief from those performance measures, such as what we're experiencing right now up in the Cook the Cook area around the migrant crisis, so that as we provide flexibility in the services, we won't have to think about how that might negatively impact our performance. You'll see that they are also looking at how to streamline the negotiations and the performance reporting so that everybody has one common template to report through. And also, as part of the negotiation process, there is a requirement in the legislation that states will have ample time to review and evaluate what DOL is suggesting our performance measure should be for a particular negotiation period. So next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, sorry, go back. I think I missed one. Okay, sorry. Here is on the one-stop service delivery. It's amending some of the requirements in the one-stop system to expand one-stop operator eligibility. So you can have a one-stop operator be a career and technical school or a public library. There's also a requirement that a joint labor management organization can be added as an interested organization or entity. The other thing that, while it's not up here on the notes, there is some clarifying language in there around controls and sort of the quote unquote firewall for local boards that choose to act as the one-stop operator. I think the big one for us in this particular area is the virtual services. And the removal of the requirement for one comprehensive one-stop. There is still some language in there that says there should be one physical location, but it removes the language for comprehensive. And then also just has some clarifying language around what virtual access is. Also, and I think this is a biggie, because I know this is always a pain point for a lot of local areas. They are removing the requirement for local boards to negotiate infrastructure funding. The downside of that, I think, for the state perspective, is that what it defaults to is the state infrastructure mechanism and the state allocating by proportionate use what those infrastructure funds are. However, if you do have an area and the local board chooses, you can develop supplemental agreements if you have additional expenses. Next slide. Eligible training providers. So this one, the language in the legislation, there's a lot of language actually, but it really talks about streamlining the process. It was a little hard to kind of fetter out what the streamlining was because it does talk more about the performance requirements and the requirement for reporting on the ETPL, particularly around all student data. I think the big things and something that we're excited about and what we've been wanting to do here is streamlining the provider application process. And for us, you know, a couple of things that we've tossed around is looking at, you know, rather than, for example, for private business vocational schools that have to apply through the Board of Higher Ed to receive a permit to operate, and then they have to come over to us and go through our separate application process. We would really like to see how that application process could be streamlined. And if, you know, for example, and this is, you know, we really have to talk about what the policy implications would be for this, but for example, if they were on the Board of Higher Ed's list for approval to operate and their program was in a demand occupation, could we just add that to our ETPL list without them going through a separate eligibility process? They're also requiring that eligibility be determined in 30 days. And then the other couple of things that I think are biggies, which I'm really happy about as Illinois looks to expand access to smaller training providers, is having a conditional eligibility status so that they can kind of get their feet under them and then establish a baseline for performance. And then finally, I really am excited about formalizing the process. So an employer can come to you and say, hey, I'm using this ABC training program at X, Y, and Z's provider, and I'm willing to pay a portion of the training program, and then that particular training provider could be put on the ETPL. Next slide, please. There's some changes around the youth. Some of them kind of caused a little bit of pause, especially because they are increasing the work experience for youth to 40%. However, I think that can be offset by having summer employment opportunities would be included in that calculation. And then if you had a student that was in a longer term internship, then that it would have to be a paid internship, and then that could also count towards the 40%. It was encouraging to see that they were going to drop the 75% expenditure youth requirement to 65%, which is, still not our preference, because, we always go in and have the waiver for the 50% youth expenditure requirement. But it does appear that the language is pretty flexible and that that's a statewide threshold rather than an individual threshold is how we're currently interpreting the language. And that's partly because then we can do some negotiation around what does an expenditure rate look like in a local area, because you might have a higher percentage of youth that you're serving in your area as opposed to maybe a different area. They also, I think as long as I've been at Office of Employment and Training, we have had a waiver to do ITAs for in-school youth. That is now being codified in legislation so that you can authorize ITAs for in-school youth. And then something else that's pretty exciting that on the surface anyway, but have to look at the policy implications, especially around reporting and performance, but you would be able to allow youth to begin serving. You would be allowed to begin serving youth while you're still making an eligibility determination, and then they are including foster or homeless youth status and aligning that definition with the Higher Education Act. Next slide, please. On adult and dislocated worker activities, there are a lot of language changes around adult and dislocated worker activities, and some that we're definitely excited about. As I mentioned earlier, of course, for us, we've already been allocating 50% of our funding towards direct training expenses. We have really been advocating, and this was actually one of the questions that the Senate Health Committee is looking very closely at, is whether or not the 50% funding expenditure rate, codifying that across the country is the right policy decision. I think many of the states or the other 7 states that were on the call were of the opinion it depends on what's included in that calculation. As the current legislation is written, they felt like it wasn't a good choice. Some of the concerns that they shared were things that we're already doing, like, for example, including OJTs, allowing leveraged funding, also allowing supportive services. Those were concerns the other states raised as things that they felt would need to be included for something like this to work. But frankly, they weren't, the other states weren't in favor of it. But we did really encourage and stress the Senate, help staff to, take a look at our policy, and agreed wholeheartedly that you have to really look at the calculation and what's included in that calculation. And it can't be a straight, direct training expenditure. And I think that's important now as ever. One of the other things that's in the legislation is like a $5,000 ITA allowance for dislocated workers, which is a good thing that would help towards the 50%. But then when you're also thinking about, the workforce Pell, that is now going to be provided for short-term occupational training. There's going to be a lot of competition, I think, for funding out there, and we really need to think critically about how all those things, leverage each other so that we're not, so that we're using the funds to the best of our ability. This is something else, a couple of the other things that, we've already been doing here in Illinois is we've been updating our career planning policy and moving towards a new system of record reporting system is requiring a competency-based assessment and not just their initial skills assessment. There's a little bit of language in there that provides I think that provides an exemption to the competency-based assessment, and it's related to I think it's related to somebody that would be going into OJT, or if it's an employer sponsored program. So the employer brings to you a staff person or brings to you a person that they're interested in hiring, and that would also be an exemption. And then again, and I kind of just alluded to this, but streamlining the intake process so that if an employer has somebody that they're willing to hire, they can go ahead and get into the program while they're waiting for an eligibility determination, and we can pay for that service. This is also, I think, something that we definitely like in the legislation is separating business services from career services, and it would be its own category rather than being incorporated in with career services. There is also some language in the bill that codifies or clarifies, I think probably is the better word, around career and individualized services. And those basic career services that we currently provide, there is specific language that that encourages those career services to be offered by employment services. So to, again, address any duplication of effort, and then individualized career services being offered by Title I. If you would like to go to the next slide, please. These are just some, so there's some changes to some of the national programs. They are codifying a couple of programs, particularly the reentry one, which I mentioned earlier. Also, they are codifying one of the community college programs. And I think for us within the Office of Employment and Training, while those are welcome things, we really would like to impress upon and continue to advocate for sort of these one-off programs, really thinking strategically about how those are offered at the national level. And because as we all know, right, stable and predictable funding really creates efficiency rather than, and supports long-term planning and implementation rather than, issuing a NOFO and then, we have 60 days to hurry up and get together a proposal for a program that may last, for a year or two. So we're really encouraging looking at stable and predictable funding. And then again, to that point, a lot of times these are temporary or sporadic opportunities. And so it takes a lot of time, as you all know, to write grant proposals for these funding opportunities. So we really would like for Congress and for at the national level for them to think very strategically about that. And then I think finally for us, the other thing is really the partnerships between the education, workforce system, and labor market. They're really necessary to ensure informed planning. I think, and this particularly speaks to a lot of the federal investments that are coming down the pike through, the bipartisan infrastructure agreement, CHIPS, the transportation funding, from some of the other agencies from economic development, is really making sure that rather than creating more of a competition, and not that competition is not healthy, because it is, but let's really look at, incentivizing partnerships and making sure all of the partners at the table are at the table to drive successful outcomes. Each of us has something that we can bring to the table. Each of the partner programs has something to bring to the table. So let's really leverage that. And we really want to encourage, Congress and the national system to make sure that they're requiring those systems work together to drive those outcomes. And then I think the other thing, that we would like to see, especially when it's DOL funding, that we're also competing for. I think one of the challenges is some of those discretionary programs, the performance metrics aren't necessarily the same as they are for Title I, which makes that, a great thing to have, but then that also creates a competition and is a disincentive, not a disincentive, but it's also harder for us, right? Because our money is very restrictive and very tied to performance, but then there's the pot of money over here that has looser performance requirements. So we would really like to see some of those programs have the same performance metrics as our Title I formula programs. I think I might have went through those a little too quickly, but that is, the very, very high level of what's happening with WIOA reauthorization. As I mentioned, we really still are wading through it. There's little, nuances and little things that, as you get deeper into it, you pick up something like the 2-year modification and the $5,000 ITA. And so what really are the policy implications for some of those changes? So with that, I will see if there are any questions in the chat, and then we can open it up for questions. And I don't, before we do that, I don't know, Julio, if there's anything that you want to add before you have to hop off, if you do have to hop off.
No, I know it's a lot of information for
Yeah.
folks, but this is sort of our first run to give you all at least a heads up on where things are going. As you can see, there are a lot of very specific changes, but then there's also stuff that's very nuanced.
Yep.
We're going to continue to lobby both through NASWA as well as NGA around specific things that we think will impact Illinois. But we are seeing a lot of alignment with other states. So if people have ideas or thoughts, we encourage you to let us know, but also work through organizations like NOB as well for very specific things that you might be thinking about at the local level. But again, this is our attempt to keep you all informed and hoping that you'll let us know if there are things that you are particularly concerned about or would like us to advocate or educate Congress about as we work through these other groups. Thanks.
Okay. Kirsten, do you want to read? Do I have all the questions in the chat, or do you want to read those between Julio and I? We can.
Yeah. So the first question in the chat is, will there be an emphasis on having a UDL approach?
Could you say a little bit more about a UDL approach?
Yeah, like universal design
Oh, yes.
approach,
Sorry.
I believe,
Yes.
is what they're referring to.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very important component, is the universal design. And certainly, for us in Illinois, every opportunity that we have to influence or shift policy in that direction, we certainly are going to be doing that. But that is definitely, I think, on everyone's mind for sure. Okay, thanks, Kirsten.
The next question is, do we know the new limit for incumbent worker funding or the new proposed limit?
I believe it's 40% is the new limit.
Those are all the questions in the chat. We did have a comment from Caroline who said an area of concern for her is that youth is up to 24 years old. We have so many who come in who are already employed and are therefore not interested or able to take on an internship or work-based learning experience. The 40% is scary to her. So that was her area of concern she shared in the chat.
Okay, great.
The next question is from Jennifer Serino, and she says, what is the definition for opportunity youth?
Opportunity youth, it's actually just the out of school definition, but so it's the 16 to 24. The one thing that they did do is they are updating the definition to specifically include youth that are homeless and youth that are in or have been in the foster care system. So those are two specific populations that they are calling out in the opportunity youth in addition to the 16 to 24.
Okay. There are no, oh, here we go. Another follow-up question from Jennifer. Any proposed changes to the requirement to bid out the one-stop operator?
I apologize that I haven't dug that deeply into it yet. Off the top of my head, I didn't really see anything significant other than specifically calling out the conflict of interest if the local board decides to be the one-stop operator and ensuring like the proper policies are in place. So it sounds like they're basically, at least in relation to a local board acting as a one-stop operator, they are just codifying, what we've been doing, at least as a state for a while now.
Someone asked if we are sending the PowerPoint out. Yes, we can send that out with the recording. Amy asks, are they going back to average earnings instead of median wage in performance?
Hold on just a second and let me look at that real quick. I think they're still using the term median in the language rather than average. They are calculating it differently though, according to the legislation that we have. Sorry, I was just looking for my notes. No, they're still calling it median. Sorry, they are still, they're using the term median. Sorry.
Thanks.
Sure.
And then is there any specific new eligibility requirements for any of the programs?
No, the only eligibility requirements are the streamlining for the dislocated workers that are adults that are already ready to be employed, and then the one around youth. Also, there is one other clarification on dislocated worker where they are allowing those impacted by trade ready that might be subject to layoff. Those are also included in the dislocated worker definition now. So it's basically aligning with the trade eligibility. And that's my interpretation, but that's what the definition looks like to me. Okay. Any other questions or comments or suggestions? We really appreciate your time today. We will, as Kirsten said, send out the PowerPoint and along with the recording link. And we will keep you guys informed of what's happening as we go along. I think, it's looking like, and at least all of the indications that we are hearing is that they would like to have a reauthorization bill signed and in place, by the end of the year. But fingers crossed, and as they say, the good Lord willing and the creek don't rise, I guess. So we'll see what happens. So if there isn't any other questions or comments, I think we'll give you guys back 15 minutes of your time.
All right. Nope, no other questions.
Okay. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.